Yeah, so first of all, let me say thanks to Aleš for organizing this very informative day so far, I guess, and for the opportunity to present some of our research and put it up for discussion. And when I say we, I mean, of course, me and Mireile, who's standing behind me, but also Simon Egbert, who is also a co-author on this paper. He can't be here today, but he says hi to everyone. And yeah, so the paper that we are presenting today, and maybe I should say that we plan to keep this a bit briefer than the previous presentations so that we can have more time to discuss with you guys. So the paper that we are presenting today is based on roughly 2 years of empirical research in the area of predictive policing that we did among the three of us. So in the end, that body of material that we collected amounts to almost 50 qualitative, semi-structured, in-depth interviews with police professionals and also representatives from public administration. But also with engineers and representatives from software companies that provide the off-the-shelf commercial tools for predictive policing that we find. So all in all, I think our material covers about 7 different commercial solutions for predictive policing. And moreover, we had also been given the opportunity to do some ethnographies. So we shadowed police officers, analysts who did the actual analytical work, and then also some of the officers that patrolled the streets. So all in all, I guess it gave us a bit of a sociologically informed insight about the actual practices of predictive policing. So that being said, something that became quite prevalent in discussions among the three of us was the variety of statistical methods or approaches, and also the underlying data sets that we encountered empirically. So there's a wide variety of different predictive policing models and softwares. And what also became prevalent in our discussions is how these statistical approaches are in turn embedded in theoretical criminological considerations, but also in institutional knowledges, and of course within larger assumptions about human behavior in terms of normalcy and deviance. And throughout the analysis of our empirical material, we were kind of struck by the key role of patterns that we find in this whole idea of analytics and then prediction and then preventive intervention. So we decided to try to systematize this notion of patterns a bit. And this has brought us to where we are right now, which is presenting a paper that is still in its quite early stages, I'd say, and hopefully getting some valuable feedback. So like I already said, there is a wide variety of different approaches to predictive policing and also the applications that we find. And these must of course be understood vis-a-vis available data sources, but also existing technical and organizational infrastructures, legal data protection frameworks, police cultures, ways in which the insights from analytics are then eventually brought to the street level, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of more social than technical factors that go into that. But what they all have in common, and I think this is a very, very interesting point, is that they all rely on the identification of patterns in the analyzed data. And I think the talk by Roman earlier has really demonstrated us some of the more sophisticated, elaborated ways in which mathematicians or statisticians try to identify patterns within data. So we proposed that instead of following the distinction between, for example, spatial approaches and individualized approaches to predictive policing, looking at the notion of pattern in more depth could actually provide us with a bit more nuanced understanding of how predictive policing plays out in practice. And the other thing is that we think that looking at this more social side and looking at how patterns become then apprehended in police work, how they become utilized and how they resonate with institutional knowledges and so on, that this brings also to the fore the politicality of predictive policing, right? I mean, there has been a lot of critical data studies that highlight how data are always manufactured, right? all these decisions that go into measuring and then preparing data for analysis, choice of different models, algorithms, and so on. I mean, it's all very political in that sense. So there's a lot of questions that target authority and politics and decision making and institutions and so on. So bringing that to the fore, or what we call here the politics of pattern. And a pattern, so by definition, and I hope you will agree with me as the only true mathematician here in the room, is something that provides a regular or intelligible form. So in that sense, it renders things discernible in a specific way. And what is important here, that a pattern is first and foremost about form and not about content, but first of all, it's about form. And the decisive question is then, and this is not only true for predictive policing, but for all kinds of data analysis. The question is then, does the pattern tell us something about the structure of society, and possibly even in conjunction with time and space, if we think about crime and prevention strategies? And if so, if it tells us something, if it really, it's not just correlations, but actual causal relations between variables. If it tells us something, what is that message, or what is the insight that we can derive from the identified pattern in the data? So when it comes to crime and policing, what does a pattern reveal about normalcy and deviance, right? And what are the implications that we derive from that if we want to prevent deviance or criminal behavior? So I guess the point that I try to highlight here is that there needs to be some kind of discernible pattern within the data, but that's not the whole story. So in order to render the pattern actionable, it needs to resonate with existing knowledges about crime in society. It needs to be connected with criminological insight that guide the analysis and so on. And from the empirical material that we collected, we have identified or tried to identify a number of different ways in which this is done by police departments across Europe. So, and I guess this is for me the cue to hand it over to Mireile.
Thank you. Now, this is a quote from a 2008 article called The End of Theory by the Wired editor at the time, Chris Anderson. So even though this is no longer surprise material, the qualities of the patterns identified in databases remain seductive. They reduce complexity. Patterns are the key to decipher insights that are hidden in enormous data sets. Patterns can easily be visualized. They give form to knowledge, which makes their insights actionable. And because they do all this, patterns much embody the spirit of efficient law enforcement. And their authority in forecasting is hard to challenge, since anything that is not based on patterns cannot be forecasted and has to be excluded a priori. That's an interviewee of ours. So without patterns, there would only be random information or no prediction. Now, what do we do in our paper? It looks like this. So we see this authority of the pattern, but show that patterns cannot be reduced to a single logic. Yes, we can say that any pattern is tied to the logic of forecast. But beyond that, we show that different patterns rise from different kinds of reasonings. And with that, we try to put the pattern's authority into perspective. So how do different patterns express distinct arguments? Within policing software, we don't only find many different patterns, but also different styles of pattern recognition. And this is what we found out when we spoke to software owners, programmers, users about their decisions on when a pattern is actually considered a meaningful pattern. And this varies a lot. So to make it easier, we organized our observation along 3 axes. First, styles of pattern recognition differ in their use of theory in algorithms that find the patterns. Second, they differ according to the kind of data used to identify the pattern. And third, the patterns focus on different targets. So altogether, we identified 4 overlapping styles of pattern recognition, which I'm going to explain to you now. So style 1 is based on a very general theories about rational choice, routine activity, and situational crime prevention, which form the basis for any prediction software, right? So these theories argue that offenders' behavior is predictable, basically, either by a probable modus operandi, by a situation that presents itself, or a combination of both. Beyond these very basic assumptions, no further theories would inform the pattern recognition in style 1. So this also means that patterns are not necessarily tied to any specific types of offenders, since any member of society could potentially be seduced to commit an offense if the opportunity only presents itself. So this style of pattern recognition would analyze any available big data sets via correlation, and a meaningful pattern is found when they basically have a successful police dispatch. Now I'm talking about style 2. That differs from this, since it uses actually parameters or legal axioms that further define the pattern that you want to find. One interviewee said, if you set the parameters wrong, you get a huge heat map. Actually, we saw one of those today in your presentation. And it looks like the whole city is burning, but it's not really burning. It's only the parameters. So you actually are telling a story that is not true. And this is why most software includes some kind of parameters in the algorithm, for example, crime generators or near-repeat patterns and so on. So style 2 can be found in models that evaluate big data sets as well as more selected small data sets. And the analysis may focus on anyone that acts according to patterns or also repeat offenders. This is different in style 3, where algorithms are programmed according to specific theoretical assumptions that are updated in each version of the algorithm. Because of that, the algorithm can even move beyond correlative forms of reasoning, if A then B, towards causal forms of reasoning. So the reason for A is B. This also means that the use of data requires a more selective approach. Data categories that do not fit specific theories would only distract from finding meaningful patterns. So often these software use small data sets that are provided by the police, and if they have proven meaningful, also additional data sets such as socioeconomic data, weather data, landmarks, and so on. So on average, these patterns target professional routine offenders. And in style 4, the pattern actually takes the shape of a rule that specific individuals may respond to or not, and that allows you to trace a network around the individual. All this is automated via a rule engine. So this approach is so far only useful for intelligence policing, since it requires very costly specific data about the individual that allows police to find out why and how the individuals respond to rules. So since the target objects are individuals and their specific behaviors, the definition of rules is more work-intensive than with other approaches. So this also becomes visible in the kind of data that is used for such approaches. It's highly selective, and it may even be complemented with adding a story to the statistical material in order to allow for the correct data evaluation. Now, we could talk more about what ties all of these 4 styles of pattern recognition together, but the point should be clear by now that even though the pattern is a condition to know and to predict crime, patterns neither follow a singular logic or reasoning nor a singular style of recognition. That alone puts the pattern's authority actually into perspective. Even though any prediction software uses patterns, their informative value, their significance, and the different stories they tell about crime vary. More importantly, these different stories actually structure decisions, actions, and understandings about crime, which is why we need to reflect about the limits and limitations that are connected to the nature of patterned knowledge. So first, patterns can only capture offenses that follow rules. This means that 1, ironically, without enough crime prediction is impossible. And 2, that predictions can only ever be generic and focus on broader trends. But finding these trends is not easy. Algorithms find more irrelevant than actionable patterns. Distinguishing random from relevant patterns is not only a lot of work, but when the amount of insignificant patterns is too high, attempts to predict rather raise uncertainty than actually help handling it. And second, pattern-based prediction is always conservative, and maybe that already answers Mark's question a bit about the temporality of predictive policing. And that is, patterns are based on past data and designed for the identification of effects, but they're applied to future developments and ex-ante interventions. And this leap in temporality from past data to future offense and in rationality from effects to ex-ante interventions are not only systematic gaps, but also confront practitioners with real challenges. Patterns may signal that intervention is needed, but beyond the potential type of offense, patterns don't give us enough insight into how to act. Their ambition is to handle symptoms. Third, what careful designers of algorithms apprehend is that biases in patterns can feed back into the culture of policing and police officers' learning processes without the necessary reflection. We talked about this a lot today already. What looks at first sight like police efficiency may in fact only be the result of pattern nudging of officers to look at specific neighborhoods and then, of course, find crime there, which is then re-imported into databases. We would tweak this argument a little bit. So instead of saying we need to eliminate bias, we need to make it more understandable, because bias is always at work through the different reasonings about crime that inform pattern recognition. So without bias, we can't do any kind of prediction. So that means, in addition, one could actually argue that the stigma actually lies in the nature of the pattern itself, namely when general trends, and we just heard, like you can only identify ever general trends with patterns, are nonetheless applied to police specific neighborhoods or even individuals. So finally, and I'm closing here, besides the effects patterns have on our understanding of crime, patterns also transport a specific understanding of crime. Criminal behavior is no longer understood as deviation from the norm, but the patterns redefine the relationship between crime and the norm. The logics inherent in patterns, clusters, categories, do emphasize the normality of crime. And yet, they also define normality as something that stands out because it can be identified. So patterns may then not recast criminal behavior as the norm, but as a norm amongst many others. And this normality of crime varies by the style of pattern recognition. So patterns do not necessarily recast the offender as a rational homo economicus, as rational choice theory would have it, neither as a purely pathological, as the positivist school would have it. But the variations in patterns and normativity portrays criminals that are acting according to various rationalities, plural, and regularities that are captured in rules and patterns. This is where I close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? We have time for a few questions.
Okay.
No, not yet.
This one.
Yeah.
I just wonder, what's your normative take? You've been sort of taking a distancing. I just wanted to hear what's your normative take about this project and on patterns.
What do you mean by normative take? As in, what is standpoint, like theoretically speaking?
No, not theoretical, in terms of, I guess, ethics, moral.
Ethics, moral, or person. Well, I guess the whole point is here not necessarily to enter this whole project with the idea of let's take the pattern down, but more like the idea is let's describe them. Let's simply describe what's happening here and make sure to see that in every single pattern's logic lies a story. And this is all we want to tell. And of course, this is a form of critical description of this is a form of critical research without really going out wanting to slaughter the algorithm as such, but more just saying like, look, I mean, we just want to show how it works, what kind of effects it produces.
And these stories, of course, variegate, right? I mean, on the one hand, on the one side of the spectrum, on the one extreme, you got these ambitions of big data, like just crunching the data and then coming up with some new insights about the world without any theoretical guidance. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, you have police departments who define or predefine very, very specifically what they're looking for, right? And it varies even between different kinds of offenses and crimes, right? I mean, if you want to prevent a burglary, you're going to come up with a different model or a different approach as compared to, I don't know, violent offenses or car theft or whatever.
There's actually a few who say that violent offenses cannot be predicted at all because this is impulsive, and so we can't really do anything about that.
So the bottom line, I guess, is the more you enrich your questions with pre-knowledges and search criteria and parameters and whatever, your stories will come out with a different ending, right? And this is how patterns shape how we can estimate crime and then build ensuing action about build on these insights, right? And there's, like we said, a wide variety, and we often feel that in the current literature, a lot of authors reduce it to either spatial approaches or individualized risk approaches. But I think, or we think, there's a whole world in between, right? That needs very careful empirical coverage in order to give us an understanding of what's going on out there. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, another question there.
Well, first, let me say I can't wait for your article to come out and me being able to quote it, so I won't have to do the systemizing of the different predictive policing approaches in my work. And I was wondering, you said you were looking at 7 different predictive policing approaches, and across Europe. What countries in Europe were you sampling? Germany, Switzerland?
We weren't sampling countries. We were looking at different softwares that would be, some of them would be based in the US, some would be based in Europe, more specifically speaking also Switzerland and Germany. But we also looked at some from Australia, so they actually cover quite a broad range of different kinds.
Okay, well then I'm looking forward to read about it in detail soon.
Another question, Dean.
Thanks, a really, really interesting paper. I'm just wondering, as part of this sort of looking at patterns, did you look at data visualization and its role in making things sort of convincing?
I wasn't allowed to. We had too many ideas in the article already. No, we had I wanted to actually talk about the semantics of patterns and the way that they're being visualized and how that kind of influences the way that they're being also, the way that they're being actionable and all these things. I guess there's so many different languages you can speak with patterns also in a visual manner. I would have loved to write about this, but I don't think we have time, we don't have space for this anymore in this paper, but I wish, yeah.
Actually, Simon and I have a paper. We had a paper in review that was just crushed by a couple of reviewers at a large cultural studies journal about specific practices of visualization and how these visualizations are being utilized within police departments as they make their journey through the institution. But yeah, apparently it was not cultural studies enough.
Maybe that's why I wasn't allowed to write about them.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to wrap up the talk. Mireile and Matthias, thank you very much. A round of applause.